So the other day I realized that I never shoot film at night, which means I'm really missing out on an amazing experience, and maybe you are too. So not only did I decide to try to change that, but also to achieve good results with as little fuss as possible. And the whole thing got me wondering, what if shooting film at night doesn't have to be overcomplicated? So I decided to test a few theories. And I have to say it went relatively well, so let's cover a few key aspects of turning your night photography into a good experience. For film, I opted to go a different direction than what you see a lot on Instagram and YouTube. I didn't choose CineStill 800T or another tungsten balanced film. I didn't choose Portra 800 either, or a higher rated film stock. I love the look of CineStill, the halation, the mood, but in the last couple of years that theme has been done quite a bit, so it was a perfect opportunity to go a different direction. I ended up choosing Kodak Gold 200 because in my experience, it's one of the cleanest looking films that I've ever used in the daytime, and I thought, why wouldn't that translate to nighttime with proper care and settings? Gold 200 has a rich color palette and lots of dynamic range, two things that I think are really high on the list for importance for night photography. While you might not think of a slower speed film as suited for night photos, I think there is an argument to be made that as long as the subject matter doesn't need high sensitivity or to be frozen in time or other variables related to shutter speed, using a lower rated film has almost no drawbacks provided you have a sturdy tripod and a little bit more time on your hands. Hot take: location and composition are more challenging hurdles in night photography than the technical side. If you can nail your location and composition, then you're much further along than you think. Getting the right settings might just be a little bit more knowledge and execution. And I have a really simple method that I used on these images to get pretty accurate exposures, and I want to go over that a little bit later in the video. Now, in terms of location, you can shoot great night scenes almost anywhere, from small towns to large cities and everything in between. There are almost always small vignettes or scenes with visual interest. That being said, sometimes there are far superior locations or parts of your state or country that might yield better night scenes. But if you can't specifically shoot where you want, it just forces you to be more creative. I want to offer a simple framework for metering film at night, and you've probably heard this term before. It's called exposed to the right, or ETTR. Now, not to confuse anyone too much, because this term is thrown around a lot in digital photography and videography, but I think this way of thinking about light is really useful for shooting film at night. The way that I think about this for shooting film at night is exposed to the right, but not to an extreme, and then potentially lower down your midtones or even your whole exposure in post-production. Film happens to love light, so a lot of disappointing night photography is more often because of underexposure than overexposure. It still takes being aware to not completely overwhelm the film negative with light, because you don't want your scene to look too bright. You want to keep that rich color and that rich dark contrast and mood to night photography. But the good news is it's actually fairly difficult to do that on film. There's a ton of latitude in the highlights to a photochemical process. Unlike digital, you don't get highlights that will fall off a cliff and completely clip. There's a roll off. So how do I go about metering film at night? Especially when my promise was to keep this simple and not overcomplicated. I simply used an app on my phone for all of these night shots. Now, I don't think that these apps were designed for being extremely accurate if there's tremendous amounts of darkness or near black tonality in your scene, but if you can find something that's roughly middle gray or about a stop under or over middle gray, you're actually in pretty good shape to use something like a metering app on your phone. It doesn't take a super fancy light meter or something really expensive. So once I have my composition dialed in, I just take out my phone and I scan the scene and I take readings off of different parts that I believe are close to middle gray. And even if they're not middle gray, if you use something like, let's say, the Ansel Adams zone system, maybe if they fall in zone 3, 4, 5, 6, or even 7, those are zones in that system where there's definite tonality in the image or in the scene. And that just means that there's obvious tonality or information for the light meter to read from. And it's kind of up to you to determine, okay, depending on this scene, am I right about in the middle from the darkest darks to the lightest lights? Or am I maybe, 40%? Am I 50%? So once I get a reading for middle gray, I'll typically add about 1/3 of a stop to a full stop of exposure. And then the last step is just to add in a little bit of reciprocity failure. So most film stocks have documentation of what their specific equation is for reciprocity failure, but in a pinch, a fairly safe equation to use is your shutter speed and then to the power of 1.3. If you do that quick calculation, it'll add a bit of exposure time, and now you're fully set up to take the image. Another set of super quick tips is to use a sturdy tripod, use a self-timer or a shutter release, and if your camera allows so, shoot with the mirror up, so that it doesn't slap down and introduce any tiny vibrations in the camera body. I don't want to get into too many composition tips for today, but I'll give you 3 super quick tips. Tip number 1 is have a clear subject or hero of your frame, somewhere for your audience to fixate on. This is just as true with night photography as it is with day. Tip number 2 is have supporting subjects or objects or counterpoint to that main hero subject. If you don't have any supporting subjects, create a sense of space that supports that main subject. Create a sense of balance. Tip number 3 is pay attention to the light and how it guides the eye throughout your scene. Pay attention to colors and color theory, color harmony. Those will get you really far, even just those 3 simple tips. I also want to give you 3 tips for scanning your film at home. Tip number 1 is try using different tone curves in Negative Lab Pro. I tend to keep finding myself using the tone curve Cinematic Rich for night photos. The way that it doesn't add quite as much of an S-curve and doesn't blow out or increase tons of contrast within the highlights directly helps pull the image down and produces rich shadows, which is a great starting point. Tip number 2 is consider what colors are most prominent in your scene and think about while you're scanning and color correcting, how can you strengthen the color harmony that's already there? Or if there are no obvious color harmonies, decide how you want your audience to feel and whether that's cold and stark or warm and inviting or anything in between. Tip number 3 is pay close attention to the types of shadows and blacks you're aiming for, whether that's super crisp jet black or faded black, a little bit more density in the shadows, a little bit less, and at what general contrast and white point you want introduced into your image. So that's really it for today, guys, just keeping it really simple. Let me know in the comments if this was helpful, if you guys plan on shooting film soon, how you guys meter at night. I'd be curious to hear any of your techniques, and I'm always available over DM, over on Instagram. I'd love to have a conversation with any of you guys about photography related subjects. So thanks again for watching, and until next time, peace.